You ever hear of a place where people vanish, and nobody gives you a straight answer why? Because that place exists, and it's called Fort Hood. Imagine being stationed at one of the largest military bases in the US. You wake up, lace your boots, salute the flag, and somewhere on that base, one of your fellow soldiers just disappears. No trace. No answers. Maybe you've heard whispers about it, or maybe you haven't. But Fort Hood has become infamous for more than just military drills and chain of command. Over the past decade, dozens of soldiers have turned up missing, dead, or worse. And the deeper you dig, the more disturbing it gets. This isn't a ghost story. This is real. And by the time this video ends, you'll know why Fort Hood is being called one of the most dangerous military bases in America and what they've tried to cover up. So what's actually happening at Fort Hood? And why are so many soldiers never coming home? Fort Hood sits on a sprawling piece of land in central Texas, over 214,000 acres to be exact. It's home to tens of thousands of active duty soldiers and their families. On paper, it's a high-security fortress of discipline and military might. But behind the barbed wire fences and security checkpoints, something else has been festering, something far more sinister. Let's rewind the clock a little. This isn't just about one case. Fort Hood has a history, and it's not the kind the Army puts on recruitment posters. Between 2015 and 2020 alone, over 150 soldiers stationed at Fort Hood died. That number isn't just high, it's jaw-dropping. Some were accidents. Some were suicides. But a disturbing number? Homicides, disappearances, cold cases that just go dark. Take the case of Private Gregory Morales. He went missing in August 2019, just 10 days before he was supposed to be discharged. 10 days. You'd think that'd raise some alarms, right? Wrong. The Army said he went AWOL. That's military talk for ditched his post. Basically, they wrote him off as a runaway. For almost a full year, nobody looked. Not seriously. It wasn't until June 2020 that his body was found in a shallow grave just outside the base perimeter. Let that sink in. He was buried less than 10 miles from where he lived and worked, and no one bothered to search. What's worse? Had it not been for the Vanessa Guillen case blowing up the media in the same month, Morales might still be rotting out there, forgotten. Now, if you don't know Vanessa's name, you should. Her case cracked everything wide open. Specialist Vanessa Guillen was just 20 years old, ambitious, tough. She had dreams of serving her country and making something of herself. But she also had a secret. She'd been sexually harassed at Fort Hood, and she told her family she was scared. She didn't want to report it officially because the culture on base made it clear, you speak up, you pay the price. On the 22nd of April, 2020, Vanessa vanished, just like that. She was last seen in the armory, working her shift. Then nothing. The Army, once again, dragged their feet. Told the media there was no foul play suspected. Claimed she probably ran off. Sound familiar? Her family wasn't having it. They went public. They shouted from the rooftops. They called the media, the press, the politicians, and finally, the story gained traction. The hashtags number Find Vanessa Guillen and number Justice for Vanessa started trending nationwide. Weeks passed. No answers. Until July. That's when human remains were discovered near the Leon River. Dismembered, burned, buried in concrete. DNA confirmed it was Vanessa. Her killer? Another soldier, Specialist Aaron Robinson. A man who, when police closed in, pulled out a gun and shot himself. Gone. Just like that. No trial. No full confession. Just silence. But Robinson didn't act alone. His girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, later confessed that she helped him dispose of the body. She admitted they tried to make Vanessa disappear permanently because she'd seen something she shouldn't have. Think about that. One soldier kills another on base, dismembers her, and it takes the world screaming for action before anything happens. Now ask yourself, how many others were ignored? Because the more you look into Fort Hood, the more skeletons start falling out of closets. In 2020 alone, 31 soldiers died at Fort Hood. Let that sink in. That's more than 2 soldiers a month, and that's just 1 year. The causes range from suicide and drug overdoses to homicides and unexplained disappearances. The numbers don't lie, but the system sure tries to spin them. And here's where things start to really spiral. You've got soldiers reporting abuse, threats, harassment, assaults, and being told to man up or deal with it. Complaints disappear, investigations stall, whistleblowers get transferred or worse, ignored completely. It's a culture of silence, of fear, of protecting reputations instead of lives. And let's not forget the toxic leadership. A 2020 independent review found that Fort Hood's command climate was permissive of sexual harassment and assault. Translation: leaders turned a blind eye while their own soldiers were being victimized. Nobody was held accountable, until Vanessa Guillen's death forced the Army's hand. 14 leaders were eventually disciplined, but even then, critics said it was too little, too late. Because here's the ugly truth. For years, Fort Hood was a machine that chewed up soldiers and spat them out. If you vanished, you were labeled AWOL. If you spoke up, you were silenced. And if you died, you were just another statistic on a forgotten spreadsheet. That's not just dysfunction. That's systemic rot. And the deeper we go, the darker it gets. So, what happened after Vanessa Guillen's death exploded into national headlines? For the first time in a long time, the Army had to face the music. Investigations were launched. Reviews were ordered. Politicians started talking tough. But here's the dirty secret they didn't want to admit out loud. Vanessa wasn't the first, and she wasn't the last. You see, Fort Hood has a pattern, not just of violence, but of silence. And it's not random. It's cultural, built in. Like rust on steel, it spreads and spreads until everything starts to corrode. Let's talk numbers again. Between 2014 and 2019, Fort Hood had the highest rate of felonies committed by soldiers of any U.S. Army installation. That includes everything from assault and theft to rape and murder. The Army's own data showed it. This wasn't fake news. It was fact. And yet no alarms, no sweeping reforms, no heads rolling. It was business as usual until bodies started piling up. Take Specialist Shelby Jones, shot and killed outside a strip mall just minutes from base. No real investigation, no arrest, no closure. Or Sergeant Elder Fernandez, missing for days, found hanging from a tree 30 miles away, declared a suicide. Case closed. Never mind the fact that he had filed a sexual abuse complaint just weeks earlier against a superior. That's the thing about Fort Hood. People don't just die. They die under mysterious, sloppy, and often infuriatingly convenient circumstances. But let's zoom out for a second. Why Fort Hood? Why this base? Fort Hood isn't just any military installation. It's a beast, a city within a city. Over 36,000 active duty soldiers, thousands more civilian employees, and a rotating population of families and contractors. It's massive, chaotic, nearly impossible to police from the inside. But that's not an excuse. In fact, that's why it should have better oversight, not less. Instead, it's become a breeding ground for abuse, corruption, and violence. A pressure cooker with no relief valve. And when soldiers are afraid to report crimes, or worse, punished for doing so, it creates a perfect storm. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you're 19. You just enlisted. You're sent to Fort Hood. You're far from home. You don't know anyone. You're low in the chain of command. Now imagine your superior starts harassing you. Maybe it's verbal at first. Then it becomes physical. You try to report it. You're told to suck it up. Maybe your next assignment gets worse. Maybe you get labeled a problem soldier. Your career stalls before it even begins. That's the reality many young soldiers faced at Fort Hood. One anonymous whistleblower described it like this: if you spoke up, your life became hell, so most of us didn't. And that silence? It allowed predators to thrive. Let's go back to 2017. A soldier named Private Megan Tuma was found dead in a motel room. 7 days had passed. She was pregnant. Her death was ruled a homicide. But what you probably haven't heard The investigation went nowhere for years. Her killer? A fellow soldier who had a history of violent behavior yet remained on active duty long after red flags had piled up. Or look at the 2021 case of Private Ana Basaldua Ruiz, just 20 years old, stationed at Fort Hood. She told friends she was being harassed. She wanted to go home. Days later, she was found dead. The Army ruled it a suicide. Sound familiar? Her parents didn't buy it. Neither did half the internet. And maybe they're right to be skeptical. Because how many suicides does it take before we stop assuming it's the truth? The pattern is this. Young soldier reports harassment to ignored to found dead to Army, blames suicide or mental health to case closed. Every single time. But there's something else going on, too. Something darker. Because not all these disappearances are tied to harassment. Some involve drugs. Some involve gangs. Some involve crime syndicates operating on and around the base. Yeah, you heard that right. According to internal reports and outside investigations, Fort Hood has become a hotbed for criminal activity. In 2018, over 200 soldiers were disciplined for drug use or distribution. Weapons, trafficking rings were discovered. Vehicles stolen from base were showing up in cartel-controlled regions of Mexico. And guess what? Many of these operations were being run by active-duty soldiers. That's not a breakdown. That's a meltdown. And it doesn't stop there. In one case, a soldier was caught smuggling undocumented immigrants across the border in his government-issued vehicle. Another was arrested for selling military-grade weapons to street gangs. One even got caught laundering money through offshore crypto wallets. How does this happen? How does one of the most powerful military institutions in the world allow this kind of chaos? Simple answer. It's not that they didn't see it, it's that they didn't stop it. And when the culture turns toxic, when leadership turns a blind eye, when soldiers disappear and no one bats an eye, that's not an accident. That's design. And here's where things get seriously twisted. Some soldiers, after going missing, are later found to have died under suspicious circumstances. But because they were labeled AWOL right away, no proper search was launched. No alerts, no media coverage. Just a bad apple narrative. It's almost like the system was built to make them vanish quietly. And that's the part that should scare you the most. Because when the people trained to protect our country can't even protect each other, what are we really fighting for? The more you dig into Fort Hood, the more it starts to feel like you're peeling back layers of a rotting onion. Every layer stinks worse than the one before it. But what happens when the rot isn't just on the surface, when it's buried deep in the chain of command? Because now we need to talk about leadership failure. Not just one bad commander, not just a few rogue NCOs, but a systemic breakdown from the top down. After Vanessa Guillen's death made national news, the Army had no choice but to launch a full-blown investigation into Fort Hood's command structure. The results? Devastating. The Fort Hood Independent Review Committee, FERC, dropped a 136-page report in December 2020, and it tore leadership apart. Here's what it said, plain and simple. Fort Hood had a command climate that was permissive of sexual harassment, assault, and criminal misconduct. Soldiers were afraid to report. The Sexual Harassment, Assault Response and Prevention, SHARP, program was a disaster. Victims weren't taken seriously. Reports were ignored, mishandled, or buried. And the leadership either didn't know, didn't care, or actively protected the abusers. That's not just negligence. That's betrayal. Now, to the Army's credit, they did take action. Sort of. 14 senior leaders at Fort Hood were either fired or suspended, including Major General Scott Efland. But here's the catch. Most weren't criminally charged. They were just reassigned, quietly. Like bad teachers getting shuffled to another school. And that's the problem. Accountability stops where inconvenience begins. One whistleblower described it this way. They protect each other. It's all about career preservation. You don't rock the boat if you want that promotion, and if someone dies, well, they'll call it a tragedy and move on. Let's pause right there. Imagine you're the parent of a soldier who died under suspicious circumstances. And the people responsible for investigating are the same ones who covered up similar cases just months before. What do you even do? Many families started fighting back. Vanessa Guillen's family became national advocates. They campaigned for justice not just for Vanessa, but for every soldier who came before and after her. They pushed Congress. They spoke out. They demanded answers. And that pressure worked. In 2021, the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was introduced in Congress. It called for massive reforms in how the military handles sexual harassment and assault. One of its biggest goals? To take prosecution of these cases out of the chain of command entirely, so victims wouldn't have to report to the very people enabling the abuse. That's huge. Because for decades, soldiers had been trapped in a system where justice depended on who you reported to. If your commander was part of the problem, you were screwed. But let's not pretend this fixed everything. Because even after all this noise, after the protests, the investigations, the media firestorm, Fort Hood kept falling short. In 2022, a report from the Department of Defense Inspector General found that Fort Hood still wasn't fully implementing the reforms recommended by the FERC. Some changes had been made, new leadership, new programs, better oversight, but core issues remained. People were still going missing, crimes were still underreported, trust was still shattered. And now, things were getting even more complicated. See, not all of the disappearances at Fort Hood were connected to harassment or assault. Some were tied to something murkier, a culture of fear, control, and internal silence. Let's talk about specialist Enrique Roman Martinez. This one is especially chilling. Roman Martinez was a 21-year-old paratrooper stationed at Fort Bragg, but went missing during a Memorial Day camping trip in 2020 with fellow soldiers. Days later, his severed head washed up on the beach. That's not a metaphor. That's real. What followed was a painfully slow investigation, filled with dead ends, contradictory statements from witnesses, and more questions than answers. His family believes he was murdered by people he trusted, and that the Army failed to take his case seriously from the jump. Now, Fort Bragg isn't Fort Hood, but the culture? Shockingly similar. And that's what we're starting to see across the board. A military-wide pattern of unaccountability. Fort Hood isn't an isolated incident, it's just the loudest. But let's zoom back in, because we haven't even talked about the area around Fort Hood. The base is located in Killeen, Texas, and if you ask locals, they'll tell you straight. Crime runs deep here. The surrounding area has long struggled with gang activity, drug trafficking, and violent crime. In fact, according to FBI data, Killeen's violent crime rate is well above the national average. Assaults, shootings, carjackings, you name it. Soldiers live here. Their families live here. And some of them get caught up in the mess, either as victims or participants. Multiple investigations have found that organized criminal groups, gangs, cartels, even biker clubs have been actively recruiting soldiers from Fort Hood. Why? Because soldiers have tactical training. They know weapons, they have access to gear, and some of them, burned out by the system or desperate for cash, take the bait. It's not just a theory. In 2017, a report revealed that over 24 soldiers stationed at Fort Hood were suspected of having ties to criminal networks. And this isn't just bad apple stuff. This is coordinated. In one case, a ring was busted for running an illegal gun smuggling operation using military armories. In another, soldiers were caught helping transport drugs across state lines using Army vehicles and IDs to avoid suspicion. And then there are the suicides that don't add up, the missing persons cases that never get solved, the bodies that turn up months later, if at all. So here's the question that keeps coming back. What is really happening at Fort Hood? Is it just crime? Just bad leadership? Just corruption? Or is it something deeper, something about a system that treats soldiers as disposable? Because that's how it feels. Soldiers enlist to serve, to protect, to fight for something bigger than themselves. They don't sign up to vanish without a trace, to be written off as AWOL the moment they go missing, to be buried in shallow graves while the chain of command carries on like nothing happened. But for far too many, That's exactly what happens. And the system keeps spinning. By now, you're probably asking the same questions so many others have asked. Why don't the soldiers speak up? Why not expose the truth from the inside? Well, some have tried. And what happened to them tells you everything you need to know. Let's talk about the silence machine, the unspoken code that keeps soldiers quiet and Fort Hood's dirty laundry locked away. Start with this. The military loves the word discipline, chain of command, obedience. But here's what they don't tell you. That culture also creates fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of getting blacklisted. Fear that your career, your future, even your personal safety can vanish the second you open your mouth. And it's not paranoia, it's been proven. In the aftermath of the Vanessa Guillen case, dozens of soldiers came forward, some anonymously, some publicly, with stories of harassment, abuse, even threats. These weren't old veterans. These were active duty men and women still living on that base, still wearing the uniform, still afraid to speak. One female soldier told investigators, "When I reported being harassed, my NCO laughed, said I was probably exaggerating. A week later, I was reassigned to a worse unit and told to toughen up." Another wrote in a now deleted Reddit thread, "You don't report it. You just try to survive your time and get out in one piece." That's the real Fort Hood survival strategy. But the most shocking statements came from soldiers who weren't just harassed, they witnessed serious crimes. One whistleblower, let's call him James, was a mechanic stationed on base in 2018. One night, during an after-hours inspection, he says he saw a fellow soldier hiding military equipment in a private vehicle. Not unusual, right? Until he realized the gear included night vision scopes and body armor stuff that shouldn't be leaving base unless signed off. James reported it to his supervisor. A week later, he was placed on extra duty. 2 weeks later, his housing situation changed. 3 weeks later, he got hit with a negative counseling report for insubordination. He says, "I went from being a model soldier to being treated like a criminal. That's when I knew. It's not about truth here. It's about control." His story isn't rare. A 2021 leaked email from a Fort Hood admin outlined what it called retention redirection practices, a vague term that essentially meant punishing or transferring those who create instability. Translation: if you report problems, you become the problem. It's not an official policy. It's worse. It's a whisper campaign, a nod and wink agreement that if you want to climb the ladder, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. And that kind of culture doesn't just protect criminals, it breeds them. Because if everyone knows there's no real oversight, predators thrive. That's exactly what happened in the case of Staff Sergeant Luis Walker, a drill sergeant at Lackland Air Force Base, which, yes, isn't Fort Hood, but stick with me. He was eventually convicted of sexually assaulting 10 female trainees. 10. But the key detail? Over a dozen reports were filed before action was taken. And what happened to the whistleblowers? You guessed it, retaliation, career sabotage, silence. Now apply that same pattern to a base like Fort Hood, larger, more chaotic, more isolated, and it's not hard to imagine how many crimes stay hidden. Some disappear forever. Because even when you die at Fort Hood, the story's not guaranteed to come out. Let's talk about Staff Sergeant Kevin Smythe. In 2020, Smythe was found dead in his on-base quarters. The initial report said, natural causes, no autopsy, no toxicology. His family pushed for more info, but got stonewalled. Months later, after hiring a private investigator, they discovered Smythe had been suffering from chronic injuries and stress-related illnesses, and had made several complaints about overwork, mistreatment, and being assigned duties while unfit for service. So why no full investigation? Because the Army system for death classification is murky and incredibly easy to manipulate. If a soldier isn't murdered and doesn't kill themselves, it's often labeled natural causes and quietly filed away. It avoids paperwork, it avoids liability, and it avoids questions. But there are so many questions. like why Fort Hood continues to have one of the highest soldier suicide rates of any base in the country, or why internal military police reports show a staggering number of unsolved assaults, vehicle thefts, and even homicides happening on or around the base, many of which are never disclosed publicly. And here's the worst part. Sometimes, it's not that the crimes are hard to solve. It's that no one bothers to investigate in the first place. Soldiers have reported waiting weeks for follow-up interviews after being assaulted. Others say they were told not to file reports at all because it'll ruin your unit's image. And some crimes just disappear from the logs altogether. In one instance, a female soldier reported waking up in the barracks with signs she'd been drugged. She tried to report the incident, only to be told she must have had too much to drink. No test, no formal case, no record. How does that happen in a military base with 24/7 security, surveillance, and command oversight? The answer? Because the system is designed to protect itself, not the people in it. That's why Fort Hood became what some soldiers now call the black hole of the Army. Because once you go in, your story might never come back out. Even Army CID, Criminal Investigation Command, the military's own law enforcement division, was called out in multiple reports for being understaffed, overworked, and poorly trained. Agents were juggling 30 to 50 open cases each. Some had no law enforcement background at all. Others were fresh out of training. And these are the people expected to solve murders? Let me say that again. Some homicide cases at Fort Hood were investigated by people with zero prior experience in law enforcement. That's not just negligence. That's a system begging for chaos. And through all of this, the silence, the failures, the disappearances, there's one more voice we haven't talked about yet. The families. Because while the Army might try to sweep things under the rug, the families of the dead, they don't forget. They don't let go. They form coalitions. They start foundations. They go to the media. They hire lawyers. They take their grief and turn it into war. Like Vanessa Guillen's family, or the mother of Elder Fernandez, or the father of Gregory Morales, who said, "The Army failed him, plain and simple. They ignored him when he was alive, and they ignored him after he died." These aren't isolated stories. These are cries for justice echoing across a base that's failed its own people over and over again. And if it weren't for these families, most of us would still have no idea what Fort Hood really is. So when the dust finally started to settle around Fort Hood's darkest moments, after bodies had been recovered, after press conferences had been held, and after the Army made all the usual promises, the spotlight shifted to Congress, to the people who had the power to actually change things. And here's where the whole thing gets even more frustrating, because the story should have ended in reform, in justice, in something that finally meant never again. Instead, it turned into politics. Let's rewind to mid-2020. Vanessa Guillen's case was everywhere. National news, social media. Celebrities were tweeting about it. People were protesting outside Fort Hood's gates. Congress couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. So Representative Jackie Speier and Representative Mark Wayne Mullen co-sponsored the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, a proposed bill designed to overhaul how the military handles sexual harassment and assault. And to be fair, the bill went hard. It proposed taking sexual harassment cases out of the traditional chain of command and placing them under the authority of independent prosecutors. That's huge, because for decades, the chain of command was the final say. And if your commander didn't believe you or was the abuser, you had nowhere to go. The act also aimed to create new avenues for reporting abuse, new protections for whistleblowers, and mandatory transparency in certain types of investigations. It had bipartisan support. Families were behind it. Veterans were behind it. Even some military leaders were like, yeah, this has to happen. But then, it stalled. Committee reviews, legislative gridlock, political maneuvering. While the bill eventually passed elements in modified forms across different military legislation, the full version never made it into law, at least not the way it was originally intended. Parts of it got chopped up and diluted, folded into larger defense packages. Language was softened, scope reduced. And meanwhile, Fort Hood kept being Fort Hood. That's the thing about political change. It moves slower than grief, slower than trauma, slower than justice. For families like the Guillens, it wasn't just about one bill, it was about a system that had allowed this to happen for decades, across multiple bases, with countless victims. And that's when people started asking the bigger question: what if Fort Hood isn't the outlier? What if it's the blueprint? Because, let's not kid ourselves, Fort Hood got attention because the victims' families refused to stay quiet. Because Vanessa Guillen's story was so horrific, so undeniable, that it broke through the noise. But soldiers have been dying, disappearing, and getting mistreated on other bases too, all over the country. The difference is, most of those stories never made the news. One former Marine tweeted, "Fort Hood's culture of silence isn't unique. It's just louder. This is happening in places like Camp Lejeune, Pendleton, Fort Bragg, you name it." And the stats don't lie. In 2021 alone, the Pentagon reported over 8,800 cases of sexual assault involving service members. That's a 13% increase from the year before, and the highest number ever recorded. Suicides among active duty personnel also hit a new high, with over 500 deaths that year alone. Let that number sit for a second. 500. This isn't just a Fort Hood problem. This is a military-wide crisis. But Fort Hood became the symbol, the cautionary tale, the warning. And not just because of what happened, but because of what the Army did after. You see, following all the backlash, the Army launched a major public relations effort. They promised reform. They renamed Fort Hood's leadership staff. They held press conferences. They released carefully worded statements. And then one of the biggest moves of all, they announced in 2023 that Fort Hood would be renamed to Fort Cavazos in honor of General Richard Cavazos, the Army's first Hispanic four-star general. Sounds noble, right? A new name, a new era, a fresh start. But critics didn't buy it. Because renaming a base doesn't fix its soul. One soldier posted anonymously, "You can slap a new name on it, but the barracks are still the same. The command culture is still the same. The fear is still the same. Nothing really changed except the signs." Others called it a rebranding effort, a way to move on from the scandals without ever fully confronting them. And here's the hard truth. They're not wrong. Because the real fix isn't cosmetic. It's cultural. It's structural. And that kind of change? It takes more than media attention. It takes time, money, oversight, and most of all, it takes accountability. But let's be honest, accountability isn't something the military has ever been good at when it comes to its own people, especially the ones who aren't wearing stars on their shoulders. Now, don't get it twisted, there are good commanders, good officers, people who want to do the right thing. Some of them risk their careers to protect their soldiers. Some fight the system from the inside. But they're swimming upstream in a river of mud. Because every time a base like Fort Hood makes the news, the military promises reform, launches investigations, suspends a few people, and then quietly waits for the headlines to die down. And when they do, everything slides back into the shadows. That's why people keep disappearing. That's why soldiers keep dying. Because the system doesn't need a villain. It just needs enough silence to keep spinning. Let's talk about the weight soldiers carry when they're stationed at a place like Fort Hood. Because long after the headlines fade, long after the news cameras pack up and go home, the trauma stays. And it stays deep. What happens to the living, the ones who served at Fort Hood and made it out alive, is a tragedy all its own. We've talked about the deaths, the disappearances, the cover-ups, but we haven't yet talked about the invisible damage. The kind that doesn't show up on casualty reports. The kind that follows you home. Let's start with something the military still struggles to admit. Mental health is a war all its own. For years, soldiers at Fort Hood have reported untreated PTSD, depression, anxiety, and what some are now calling moral injury. That's when you see or experience something so deeply wrong, something that goes against your core values, that it breaks you in ways no amount of physical armor can protect against. And Fort Hood? It's been a factory for moral injury. We're talking about soldiers who reported abuse only to be ignored, who watched fellow service members vanish or die under suspicious circumstances, who were ordered to stay quiet, who felt helpless in a system that was supposed to protect them. You think that doesn't leave scars? One former Fort Hood soldier posted online, "I left that place alive, but I'll never be the same. I don't trust leadership. I don't trust the system. And worst of all, I don't trust myself anymore." Another said, "Watching the way Vanessa's case was handled made me realize how easily any of us could disappear. I didn't sleep for weeks." These aren't soft people. These are trained warriors, combat veterans. But trauma doesn't care how tough you are. It seeps in through the cracks. And Fort Hood created a lot of cracks. In 2021, the Army quietly released internal data showing that nearly 1 in 4 Fort Hood soldiers had accessed mental health services in the past year. That number might seem promising, like people are getting help. But here's the problem. For everyone who gets help, dozens more suffer in silence. Because the stigma in military culture is still real. You admit to struggling. You risk being labeled unstable. That can cost you promotions, assignments, your future. So most just shut up and suffer. And then there's the real-world consequences. According to a 2022 VA report, soldiers who served at Fort Hood between 2014 and 2020 were more likely to develop post-service PTSD than those stationed at any other major Army base during the same period. Think about that. More than Iraq, more than Afghanistan. Fort Hood broke more minds than the battlefield. How? Because trauma doesn't just come from war zones. It comes from betrayal, from fear, from being silenced when you try to speak, from watching your friends get buried while the people in charge make excuses. Let me tell you about Mike. Not his real name. He served at Fort Hood from 2016 to 2019. Infantry. Decorated. No issues until his roommate was found dead in the barracks. Official reports said it was suicide. But Mike knew better. They had just finished talking the night before. The guy was upbeat, making plans to visit home. Nothing about it made sense. Mike started asking questions. He went to his superior, got told to let it go. He brought it up at a unit meeting, got pulled aside afterward and warned that his attitude was becoming a problem. 3 months later, Mike was reassigned to a unit with higher stress, longer hours, and more disciplinary oversight. He says, "They didn't punish me directly. They just made life harder. The message was clear: drop it or we'll break you." Mike developed severe anxiety, started drinking, got into a fight off base. Eventually, he was discharged with a behavioral issue. No support, no therapy, just goodbye. He now lives out of his car. And Mike isn't alone. There are hundreds of soldiers just like him cast out, broken, isolated, all carrying the psychological fallout of Fort Hood's failures. Even those who didn't suffer directly feel it. The constant tension, the fear, the knowledge that you could be next, and that if you disappear, no one might even look. And let's not ignore the families again. Because trauma doesn't stay on base. It bleeds into homes, relationships, children, parents. One mother of a Fort Hood survivor said, "He came back changed. He doesn't talk about it. He flinches when the phone rings. He won't sleep with the lights off." This is what Fort Hood leaves behind. Not just bodies in shallow graves, but walking ghosts, men and women who survived, but never healed. And here's what really stings. The Army knows this. They've seen the numbers, heard the testimonies, read the reports. They know the psychological damage is real, that it's widespread. That Fort Hood became a pressure cooker for breakdowns, suicides, and shattered lives. But knowing isn't enough, because without accountability, awareness is just a shrug. And if the same toxic structures stay in place, then all the therapy in the world won't stop the next soldier from ending up just like Mike. Or worse, ending up like Vanessa. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that military leadership doesn't want to say out loud. It's not just what happened to the soldiers who died. It's what keeps happening to the ones who survive. And as long as Fort Hood or Fort Cavazos, or whatever name they give it next, continues to operate under the same old culture, that cycle won't stop. Let's pull back. After all the bodies, after the investigations, after the public outrage, after the congressional hearings, media frenzies, lawsuits, and promises of change, there's one question that still hasn't been fully answered. Why was Fort Hood allowed to rot for so long? Let's be honest. The signs were there. Red flags going back over a decade. Whistleblowers, deaths, harassment reports, family complaints, suicides, criminal activity. None of this came out of nowhere. So why didn't anything really change until it was too late? Because the silence wasn't accidental. It was designed. See, Fort Hood wasn't just a base, it was a brand. One of the largest army installations in the world, a powerhouse of readiness, a symbol of U.S. military strength. Over 30,000 soldiers, billions in federal funding, political influence woven into the very ground it sat on. And you don't shake a brand like that without consequences. That's the real reason this went on for so long. It wasn't that no one knew. It was that too many people had too much to lose. Military leaders didn't want the blowback. Politicians didn't want the headlines. Contractors didn't want their revenue streams disrupted. So they all played along, ignored the problems, downplayed the reports, allowed the culture to fester because accountability was bad for business. And then, when the truth finally spilled into the open, they scrambled not to fix it, but to control the damage. The Army's PR machine kicked into overdrive. The message was clear. We're taking this seriously. We're investigating. We're reforming. But let's break that down. Who conducted the investigations? The Army itself, or hand-picked committees with limited oversight? Who controlled the messaging? The same institutions trying to protect their reputations. Who got punished? A handful of officers, quietly reassigned, allowed to retire with full benefits. And what did they do to fix the culture? They changed the name, painted over the rot with a fresh coat of honor. But the base is still there. The history is still there. The truth is still there. And maybe that's why Fort Hood, or Fort Cavazos, if we're using the new name, feels like a national wound that still hasn't closed. Because the issue wasn't just one bad case. It was a system that allowed people to vanish, suffer, or die without justice. And the worst part? It's still happening. Even now, new reports are coming in from other bases. Soldiers still afraid to speak. Families still demanding answers. Whistleblowers still getting pushed out. Because what happened at Fort Hood wasn't unique. It was just the one we finally noticed. So what do we do with that? What do we do when the very institution that's supposed to protect its people becomes the thing they fear? The truth is hard to swallow, but here it is. Until the military values people over power, until leadership is held accountable with more than a slap on the wrist, until justice is the standard, not the exception, another Vanessa will die. Another Gregory will disappear. Another soldier will break under the weight of silence. And we'll be right back here again, telling another version of the same story. But it doesn't have to be that way, because real change doesn't come from a press release. It comes from pressure, from families refusing to shut up, from soldiers who speak out anyway, from viewers like you who don't look away. The question now isn't, what happened at Fort Hood? We know what happened. The real question is, will we let it keep happening? If this story made you stop and think, if it made you angry, sad, or uncomfortable, good, that means you're paying attention. Now go deeper. Click the video on your screen right now. It exposes even more of what the military doesn't want you to know. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because this is only the beginning.